Good morning. Today I will be talking about architectural preservation, in specific, this use or term genius loci and preservation and how that applies to Boston. So genius loci can be directly defined as spirit of place. Delphi in Greece is the quintessential location where this has been applied to define it, and it is how a context or a surrounding is integrated into a site, a building, a landscape in this regard. And so Delphi is full of temples, treasuries, amphitheaters, and theaters built in the Greek style. It is an Olympic space, and so how it fits into this natural beautiful landscape, the heroic ideal, as well as honestly the godliness that is represented here, imbues this architectural, this man-made sphere with some sort of intangible personality or character. And so I wanted to take this definition or this concept of genius loci and see if it could be applied to an urban context. So the goals of my case study, or my study, were to look at different case studies around the city that were potentially representative of different districts and see if there was an underlying theme of preservation or if individual case studies were completely autonomous. I also wanted to investigate whether the districts could be looked at in a cohesive form and if genius loci could be applied to Boston as an entire city. So this is a zoning map of Boston to give you an idea of the different districts that are in it. I have in red the 4 case studies I looked at: the old Corner Bookstore in downtown Boston, the Paul Revere House in the North End, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in the Fens, and also the Boston University Dahod Family Alumni Center, or the BU Castle, which is in Back Bay West. Now, my first case study was the old Corner Bookstore. Now, this building was built in the 18th century as an apothecary shop and a residence, and since then it has provided a commercial or community or a community aspect to this downtown area. It is a commercial district, and so it needs to partake in the economy of this area. During the 1930s through 60s, it was abandoned as during the Great Depression, and in 1960 it was slated to be torn down. However, it was saved by a nonprofit and rehabilitated. The preservation I looked at here was adaptive reuse and the ability to modernize and update a building to still fit those needs. And so today it is a Chipotle, which may seem potentially inauthentic historically. However, I argue that it is not, as it is still fulfilling a purpose within its district, within its community, as it did as an apothecary shop. The second case study I looked at was the Paul Revere House, which most notably is the residence of Paul Revere from 1770 to 1800. However, the building itself is the only wooden structure from the 17th century, and so it has 2 periods of historical significance. It was preserved around 1900 in a restoration aspect, and so it was restored to both the 17th and the 18th centuries, so it's not particularly authentic to either. It is an amalgamation or a combination of both, which is a unique or different preservation practice. And the North End, as we all know, is an extremely historic district, and so how this fits into that context is what I looked at in the terms of the districts. This is a map, the oldest known map of Boston, the Bonner map from 1722. And as you can see here, I've outlined these 2 case studies, which are in the oldest parts of the city. These are some other buildings or spaces you may recognize today that were built prior to 1722, such as Old Cops Burying Ground, the Old State House, as well as the Union Oyster House. And these are some of the roads that, again, are visible today, but were built prior to 1722. As you can see, the North End particularly is very fleshed out, it is very much the same as today. And so the bones of the neighborhood, that context, that area surrounding it, remains relatively unchanged. This is the same information you just saw, but on a map from 1814. And this is the updates. By that time, you'll recognize Faneuil Hall is now there, as is the new State House, the Old North Church. And this time it's downtown Boston, that commercial district that looks very similar to it does today. And so placing these buildings within their context, their historic context, as well as their contemporary one, offers a view into how they have changed or remained the same. Thirdly, I looked at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, located in the Fens. This was built around 1901 as a Venetian palazzo museum. It is a revival style, and I'll use that term later on. So revival is an architectural term to illustrate what tropes that a particular building may draw upon. So it doesn't mean that these buildings are facsimiles of historical architectural styles, but rather they draw upon different characteristics. In this case, Venetian Renaissance architecture is evident in a more modern, as in 1900 perspective, with the elevation of the hierarchies in the building, the arches and the columns that are used inside, as well as the layout of the courtyard within the building itself. Now that, I believe, can also be applied to the 2012 adaptive reuse. The preservation practice I looked at here was new design in historic places and additions. This is a Renzo piano addition, completed in 2012. And while it is extraordinarily modern, I again argue that this is a revival style. It was built by an Italian architect with the similar materials that the old Venetian palazzo used, and in a deference to that primary building. It's not trying to overshadow the ISGM. Instead, it is paying homage to it in certain respects. Even the interior, the grand staircase in this new edition, is actually a Michelangelo design. The Isabella Stewart Gardner resides in the Fens, as you can see here, which prior to the mid-19th century was a marshland. Frederick Law Olmsted designed the Emerald Necklace system, which you can see. And after that, institutions flocked to the area because it was a large expanse of land that was hitherto undeveloped. There are multiple revival styles evident in these buildings. Again, so classical, the Museum of Fine Arts, for instance, isn't a Greek temple. It merely uses Greek aesthetic principles of layout, of columns, pediments, things that you identify as classical architecture. The fourth case study I looked at was the BU Castle. This was built in around 1915 as a family residence and remained so until it was bought by Boston University in the 1930s. It was then the president's residence, and then after that, an alumni center. You may have noticed that it was being preserved here the last few years. It was both remodeled, restored, and added onto. The interior, first floor, and exterior were restored to its original look, but the upper floors, as well as the pub in the basement, were both remodeled, updated to allow access and modern facilities. And this resides in the Back Bay West neighborhood. We call it Bay State Road. It is, again, a revival district. All of these buildings were built in about a span of 15 years, and so are very cohesive architecturally, despite the different styles evident here. I will say that the buildings that I have not outlined are predominantly federal and classical style brownstones, and so the entire neighborhood has this very homogeneous feel. So looking at these four case studies, I had a few conclusions to make. One, that preservation physically in Boston has numerous faces. It depends on the case study that you're looking at as to how the actual physical preservation occurred. However, on an intangible level, I believe that there is an underlying theme running throughout the city, that it is this genius loci, per se, this spirit or this quality of these districts that determines how individual cases and projects are restored or preserved. And so finally, yes, genius loci can be applied to an urban context, in this case Boston, because it is the individual buildings that contribute to the characters of the individual districts, which in turn are all stitched together to create this identifiable, unique character or personality that we know and call Boston. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? No? All right. Yes?
What are some of the similarities between some of the buildings you saw here and the ones in the Greek ones that were your...
In Delphi?
Yeah.
So physically, not very much. It's not so much the actual the actual buildings that are similar. It's more of how they're related to their neighborhoods. And so, for instance, the Back Bay is a residential neighborhood, always has been, and so how the castle fits into that context as a revival style, as this kind of quiet neighborhood, but still contributing to that neighborhood as it did when it was built, that's how I kind of related it. Similarly, the old Corner Bookstore in a financial district or commercial district still being part of that and drawing some of its meaning from its surroundings. Yes, Danny.
As everybody knows, Boston is going through some major construction, and the skyline is changing drastically. I guess I would wonder what your thoughts would be on how that might impact our genius loci, and particularly given the uniqueness of each of the neighborhoods and how that larger theme may be felt.
Yeah, so that was one of the challenges I actually looked at, is how does a city kind of keep up with the modern needs of its community, of its growing community, but also still retain that historic aspect. And that's why one of the reasons I chose Boston in particular, because it is one of the oldest cities in the nation. And so how has it managed to retain this, even though it's been modernizing for centuries, right? This isn't the first time that Boston skyline has changed. And so, yes, some of the buildings are getting taller, but I do believe that for the most part, those skyscrapers are in the newer parts of the city, or that downtown city or space, the Prudential Center, the John Hancock building, for instance. They're not in the North End. They're not in these more historic neighborhoods where potentially zoning laws restrict how tall a building can get. There's a reason that those are there. It is to actually retain that almost touristic aspect, because that's one of the parts of the city that we have to retain to draw people in. So I do think it's interesting. There are definitely, Boston does draw upon its history and new architecture. You see new apartment buildings that still have maybe not the typical brownstone bay windows, but have different modernized tropes that they still draw upon. But we're not halting progress. It's absolutely allowed to progress, as we saw the Renzo Piano edition, for instance. It's just that is still all about culture and all about growth in the city. It's just how do you do that in a respectful way? So, yeah. Yes, Praveen.
Hi, great presentation. I was kind of in a similar vein to Danny's question. There's this like trend of kind of stripping the interior of structures
Yep.
In order to replace it with a completely different function. And
Yeah.
a lot of your case studies used like adaptive reuse as a model, especially the old Corner Bookstore. And you justified it as acceptable because the function of the place is still rooted in its district. I was wondering how you felt about these kind of modern housing structures that are more like old churches renovated into luxury condos placed at like 1.2 million a piece.
Right.
Like, where does that fit into the cultural dynamics or this kind of genius look at?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. So Boston has a history of facadism, and whether you like that or not is beside the point. We do that, right? We gut buildings and keep the exterior to maintain how it looks from a street view, but completely remodel it. And there's this particular church that comes to mind, and you bring that up, that actually Feingold Architects did, the same ones who did the View Castle, where they just tore out the roof of the church and built upwards. My initial reaction is, uh-oh. However, I think that it depends on what perspective you're looking at it. It's, again, trying to adapt this historic setting, which potentially doesn't have as many relevance anymore, particularly churches, which are really hard to renovate and keep their original function. And so it's housing crisis is huge in the city, and how do we use that is reuse these old spaces that still have character, still have meaning in the city, but change that meaning. And contexts do change; they aren't static. And so that's one of the ways of looking at it. Personally, it is kind of a questionable action or use. So it depends on the person. Yes. All right.